Hello everyone, my name is Lucas Pham, and in this video, I'll be sharing my research and practice process on Chopin's Étude Opus 25 No. 6, also known as the Double Thirds Étude. This Étude is one of Chopin's technically demanding works, particularly because of its continuous double third passages. These passages require a high level of finger independence, coordination, evenness, and movement control. Throughout my own practice, I found that simply playing the passage slowly did not always solve every technical difficulty. While slow practice helped me become more familiar with the notes and movements, I found that different technical problems required different approaches. This became the focus of my research, where I explored four slow practice strategies: basic slow tempo practice, segmented or chunking practice, rhythmic variation practice, and slow staccato practice. During the practice intervention, I documented my progress through reflective journal entries and video recordings. I then examined the technical changes and observations that emerged throughout the practice process. In this video, I'll take you through these four strategies, demonstrate how I applied them to Chopin's Double Thirds Etude, and share what I discovered about how they can work together when practicing technically demanding piano work. So, rather than simply asking which practice strategy is the best, I wanted to explore a more practical question. How can different practice strategies be selected and combined to address specific technical problems? Before looking at the four practice strategies, it is important to understand why Chopin's Double Thirds Etude presents such a demanding technical challenge. The main difficulty comes from the continuous double thirds throughout the piece. Instead of playing single notes, each movement requires two fingers to coordinate simultaneously, while the hand has to move efficiently from one interval to the next. At first glance, the passage may seem to be mainly a problem of speed. However, when I began practicing it slowly, I realized that there were several other challenges involved. I had to pay close attention to fingering, because uncertainty in the fingering could immediately affect the accuracy of the following double thirds. I also became more aware of finger independence, since the fingers have to work together while maintaining an even sound between the two notes. Another challenge was the connection between successive double thirds. Even when I could play individual intervals accurately, moving smoothly from one interval to the next was not always easy. I also noticed that unnecessary tension could develop when I tried to control every movement consciously. This became particularly noticeable when I repeated difficult passages for longer periods. Therefore, the technical problem was not simply about playing the notes faster. It involved developing accurate fingering, coordinated finger movements, evenness, efficient transitions, and greater awareness of physical movement. This was important for my practice process because it meant that slowing the tempo alone could reveal these problems, but it did not necessarily provide a solution to all of them. This led me to investigate whether different practice strategies could target different aspects of the technical problem. The following sections will demonstrate the four strategies I used and what I observed from each one. The first strategy I investigated was basic slow tempo practice. This involved practicing the double third passages at a considerably slower tempo than the intended performance tempo, while maintaining the correct fingering and movement. Before slowing the passage down, I found that it was easy to focus mainly on getting through the notes. When I reduced the tempo, however, I had more time to pay attention to what my fingers and hand were actually doing. At this tempo, I could concentrate more carefully on the fingering and become more familiar with the sequence of notes. It also made certain technical difficulties more obvious. For example, some fingerings that felt manageable at a faster tempo felt awkward when I had to execute them slowly and deliberately. thing I became more aware of was my hand and wrist movement. Playing slowly gave me more time to notice whether I was using unnecessary movement or tension. I also found that practicing slowly reduced mistakes caused by uncertainty. Instead of immediately repeating the passage after making an error, I could stop, identify the problem, and consciously prepare the movement before trying it again. This was also reflected in my practice journal, where I noted increased familiarity with the passage, greater movement awareness, and more secure fingering during slow practice. However, I also realized that slow practice had its limitations. Although it helped me understand and control the passage, it did not automatically solve every technical problem. Some sections remained difficult when I tried to reconnect them or increase the tempo. This led me to the next strategy, where instead of practicing the entire passage as one unit, I divided it into smaller sections. This became the basis for my second strategy, segmented or chunking practice. The second strategy I explored was segmented or chunking practice. Instead of practicing the entire passage continuously, I divided it into smaller musical units and focused on each section separately. The purpose of doing this was to reduce the amount of information I had to control at one time. I could concentrate on a particular group of double thirds, identify the movement that was causing difficulty, and repeat the section before moving on. After the individual sections became more secure, I began reconnecting them. This was an important part of the process, because being able to play an isolated section did not necessarily mean that I could immediately connect it smoothly with the next one. I therefore also practiced the transitions between chunks. However, segmentation also showed me that technical control at the level of a small section does not automatically transfer to the entire passage. I still needed to return to the larger musical context and check whether the improvements remained when the sections were connected. This made segmented practice particularly useful as a targeted strategy rather than something I would necessarily use for the entire piece. After working on the passage through slow tempo and segmentation, I wanted to explore another problem. What happens when the notes are already familiar, but the double thirds still feel uneven or difficult to coordinate? This led me to the third strategy, rhythmic variation practice. The third strategy I explored was rhythmic variation practice. Instead of repeatedly playing the double thirds with their original rhythmic pattern, I changed the rhythm of the notes to create different movement patterns. First, I played using its original rhythm. I then introduced different rhythmic groupings, such as long-short pattern and short-long pattern. At first, these variations felt quite unnatural because they changed the way I normally organize the movement. However, this was also what made the exercise useful. I had to pay closer attention to the individual fingers and the movement between successive double thirds. I noticed that some double thirds felt relatively even when played normally were actually less consistent when I changed the rhythm. The rhythmic variation practice therefore helped me identify differences in finger control that were not immediately obvious during normal playing. Another aspect I became more aware of was the connection between one double third and the next. The different rhythmic groupings changed which finger movements received more emphasis, which made me pay greater attention to the coordination between the intervals. After practicing with the rhythmic variations, I returned to the original rhythm. I found that the passage felt more controlled and that the transitions between the double thirds were more smoother. This suggested to me that rhythmic variation was particularly useful when the basic notes and fingering were already familiar, but the movements still lacked evenness or coordination. My practice journal also reflected this observation, particularly in relation to finger independence, evenness, and the connection between successive double thirds. However, rhythmic variation was not simply a replacement for slow practice. I still needed to return to the original rhythm and tempo to determine whether the improvement could be transferred back into the actual passage. This made rhythmic variation another targeted strategy. Rather than using it for every problem, I found it most useful when I needed to challenge and refine the coordination of movements that were already familiar. The final strategy I explored approached the movement in a different way. Instead of changing the rhythm, I changed the articulation and practiced the passage slowly with a detached staccato touch. The fourth strategy I explored was slow staccato practice. Instead of playing the double thirds with their usual connected articulation, I practiced them slowly with a detached touch. The purpose was not simply to make the passage sound staccato, but to make each individual double third more clearly defined. This encouraged me to pay closer attention to the attack and release of each interval. I found that the detached articulation made individual finger movements easier to identify. Rather than allowing one double third to flow automatically into the next, I had to consciously release and prepare each movement. This also made physical tension more noticeable. When I repeated the passage, I became more aware of moments where I was using unnecessary force or holding tension in my fingers and hand. After working with the slow staccato approach, I returned to the original articulation. The main difference I noticed was a greater awareness of the individual movements within the passage. The double thirds felt more clearly defined, and I had a better sense of when to release one movement before preparing it to the next. My journal observations similarly indicated improvements in finger articulation, precision, release, and physical awareness. However, like the other strategies, slow staccato was not something I would apply continuously to the entire etude. I found it more useful as a targeted exercise when I needed to examine individual movements, improve release, or become more aware of unnecessary tension. At this point in the practice process, I had explored 4 different approaches. The important question was therefore no longer what each strategy would do individually, but how this strategy could work together. After working the 4 strategies individually, I began to see that they were not competing approaches, but complementary strategies that address different technical problems. As summarized in Table 7, basic slow tempo practice provided a foundation for familiarity and movement awareness, while segmented practice helped isolate specific difficulties. Rhythmic variation was useful for refining evenness and coordination, while slow staccato encouraged greater precision and awareness of individual movements. What became particularly important was that these strategies did not need to be used separately or in a fixed order. As my practice developed, I found myself returning to different strategies depending on what was happening in the passage. For example, a passage might require slow tempo practice to establish the fingering, followed by segmentation to isolate a difficult section. Rhythmic variation could then be introduced if the movement remained uneven, while slow staccato could be used when greater precision or release was needed. This led to one of the main insights from my research. The effectiveness of a practice strategy depends on the technical problem it is being used to address. Rather than asking which strategy is the best, I began to ask what the specific problem was and which approach, or combination of approaches, could best address it. This became the basis for the final stage of my practice process, developing a flexible way of combining the 4 strategies when approaching a technically demanding passage. After exploring the 4 strategies individually, I began to combine them within the practice of Chopin's double thirds Étude. Rather than following a fixed sequence, I selected different strategies according to the technical problem I encountered during each practice session. For example, I could begin with slow tempo practice to check the fingering and movement of a passage. If a particular section remained difficult, I would then isolate it through segmented practice. Once the movement became more secure, I could introduce rhythmic variation to work on evenness and coordination. If I noticed unclear articulation, difficulty with release, or unnecessary tension, I could then use slow staccato to examine the individual movements more closely. After using one of these strategies, I would return to the original passage to see whether the change had transferred back into normal playing. This process was not always linear. Sometimes I needed to return to slow practice, while at other times I moved directly between segmentation, rhythmic variation, and slow staccato depending on what I noticed. My later practice therefore became more problem-oriented. Instead of simply repeating the passage, I first identified what was preventing the passage from feeling secure and then selected the strategy that seemed most appropriate. The later journal entries reflect this change as the four strategies were increasingly combined rather than practiced as completely separate exercises. This allowed me to use the strategies as different tools within the same practice process. Overall, the four strategies became complementary rather than independent methods. The purpose was not to complete one strategy before moving permanently to another, but to revisit and combine them whenever different technical problems appeared within the double thirds passage. Through this practice-based investigation of Chopin's Étude Opus 25 No. 6, I explored four different approaches to slow practice: basic slow tempo practice, segmented practice, rhythmic variation, and slow staccato practice. Rather than finding one strategy that was universally more effective than the others, I found that each approach provided a different way of addressing the technical challenges within double third passages. More importantly, I found that the strategies could be combined and revisited throughout the practice process according to the difficulties I encountered. This changed my understanding of slow practice. It is not simply about reducing the tempo, but about creating different conditions in which specific aspects of a technical problem can be identified and worked on more deliberately. The main limitation of this investigation is that it focused on my own practice of a single piece. Therefore, the observations cannot be generalized to every pianist or every technically demanding repertoire. However, the process provided useful insight into how different practice strategies can be adapted within individual piano practice. Ultimately, this project has changed the way I approach technically demanding passages. Rather than simply repeating a difficult passage, I now consider what the specific problem is and how I can modify my practice to address it. And that brings us to the end of my research and practice journey with Chopin's double thirds Étude. I hope this video has given you a glimpse into not only the challenges of learning this piece, but also how different practice strategies can be combined to work through them. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed coming along for the journey.